Step into Buckingham Palace, or Windsor Castle if you prefer. Vast, glittering, and yet suffocating. Inside these walls, even the way you breathed felt regulated. Every glance, every gesture, every shuffle of your shoes carried weight. Bow at the wrong angle, linger in the wrong corridor, or heaven forbid, take a seat before the Queen had done so, and your career could end before the candles had even burned low. Because here, the palace wasn't just a building. It was a machine of etiquette, a stage of endless performance where survival depended on memorizing rules that changed with rank, mood, and tradition. And before we wander too far into this gilded labyrinth, I want to know, what time is it where you're listening from? Drop it in the comments below. I'm curious to know how many of you are trying to fall asleep at completely unreasonable hours. And while you're at it, subscribe or remain as invisible as a palace footman pressed into the shadows. You've stepped across the threshold now, and instantly it becomes clear. This isn't a home, not in the way you think of one. The palace is a machine. Vast, gleaming, and mercilessly efficient, a place where the air itself feels heavier because everything here is loaded with rank, meaning, and expectation. At the very top sits the monarch herself, Queen Victoria. Her presence radiates outward through every hall, every chamber, every servant's schedule, like a sun whose gravity you cannot escape. Whether you're a duke, a chambermaid, or a guard outside in the damp night air, your life bends toward her. You rise when she rises. You pause when she pauses. You don't just work for the crown, you orbit it. Beneath her, an entire web of authority stretches downward. First, the courtiers, men and women of noble birth, draped in titles that sound like they were invented to fill time at dull dinners. Lord Chamberlain, Mistress of the Robes, Gold Stick in Waiting. They're not there simply for decoration. They are the enforcers of etiquette, the living rule book of the palace. And beneath them comes the household staff, the secretaries, equerries, and attendants who manage the flow of the Queen's day like human cogs in a watch. Then further down the ladder, the guards, stoic, stone-faced, and symbolic. They hold halberds or rifles polished to perfection. But their most important job isn't combat, it's presence. They are the immovable pillars reminding everyone, especially you, that this building is not a place of comfort. It's a fortress of ritual. And finally, at the base, the ones who make the whole edifice function, the servants, invisible by design, yet carrying the heaviest load. They stoke the fires, carry coal scuttles up endless stairs, scrub soot from fireplaces that blacken again within the hour. They wash the linen, polish the silver, haul in gallons of water. They are the unseen pulse beneath the marble skin of the palace. It is tempting to imagine the Queen's home as warm and domestic, a place where laughter echoes down the corridors and where family life unfolds naturally. But this is no family nest. This is a factory of appearances. Every movement, every sound, every item of furniture tells you who matters and who doesn't. Take the architecture itself. It is a map of rank, carved in stone and gilded with chandeliers. The grand corridors, broad, high-ceilinged, lined with marble and portraits of royal ancestors glaring down, are for those who belong. You walk them only if your presence has been requested, and even then, your steps must fall softly, your eyes cast downward unless invited to look up. Meanwhile, the service passages run like veins behind the walls, narrow and dim, connecting kitchens, sculleries, and servants' quarters. They exist to keep the machinery hidden. If you belong to that hidden world, you know them by heart. Which passage leads to the dining room without crossing the main hall? Which staircase creaks the least under the weight of a coal scuttle? For servants, the palace is a labyrinth designed to make you disappear, and vanish you must. For if the grand corridors declare rank, the service corridors erase it. To be noticed in the wrong place is to risk dismissal. Servants are trained to flatten themselves against the wall when a noble passes, eyes lowered, bodies angled. The less of you there is, the safer you are. Even the Queen's own children grow up knowing this isn't a house in the ordinary sense. There are nurseries, yes, but they are ruled with military precision. Governesses enforce silence, servants obey without comment, and every door is a threshold where rank dictates who steps first. The palace doesn't nurture, it disciplines. And you, where do you fit? If you're a courtier, you live on the knife's edge of visibility. Too invisible, and you'll fade into irrelevance, replaced by the next eager baroness or equerry. Too visible, and you risk overstepping, drawing the Queen's disfavor. If you're a servant, you live by invisibility, but still under scrutiny. One mistake with the firewood, one misplaced napkin, and your name may find its way onto a dismissal list. The palace doesn't forgive easily. And let's not pretend this system was flexible. The rules were iron bars. Step into the Queen's presence uninvited? Career suicide? Forget to bow or curtsy correctly? Your name becomes a byword for clumsy irreverence. Walk through the wrong corridor? That's not just a blunder. It's a mark of insolence. Every corridor has its owner, every chair its protocol, every gesture its risk. Even the smallest details reinforce this hierarchy. Look at the floors. Parquet polished so smooth they reflect the light of chandeliers like water. Those are for noble feet. Behind the walls, worn stone stairs spiral downward, slick with years of coal dust and candle drippings. Those are for servants. The palace is two buildings at once, the gleaming facade for the world to admire, and the grumbling machinery hidden just out of sight. And yet, there's a kind of grim beauty to it. This was how monarchy sustained itself in the age of steam and empire. The palace was theater, but theater with teeth. Every bow you offered, every passage you avoided, every silence you endured was part of the performance. And failure meant exile from the stage. So as you step deeper into the palace machine, remember, this is not a home where warmth and comfort guide the day. It's a hierarchy carved into stone, humming with protocol, built to remind everyone, from dukes to footmen, that they are merely players, and the script has already been written. And you're now in the cast, whether you like it or not. Now that you've found your place in the palace machine, it's time to learn the rules of survival. And no rule mattered more than deference, not respect in the casual modern sense of be polite. No, this was a full-body performance, a daily dance of bowing, curtsying, and carefully edited sentences, all designed to remind you that you are not, and never will be, equal to the monarch. Start with greetings. If you ever have the honor of meeting Queen Victoria, remember, you do not say hello. You do not extend your hand as if she were your aunt stopping by for tea. The correct form of address is Your Majesty the first time, and ma'am afterward, pronounced to rhyme with jam, not palm. Get it wrong, and you'll hear about it. If not from her, then from every horrified courtier within earshot. And if you're speaking to a prince or princess, that's Your Royal Highness, followed by Sir or Ma'am. Every word is a little brick in the wall of deference, carefully laid to keep you at your proper distance. And then comes the bow or curtsy. Forget casual nods. The bow must be deliberate, deep enough to convey humility, but not so exaggerated that you appear mocking. If you're a man, you dip your head and shoulders slightly, feet together, hands at your sides. If you're a woman, you perform the curtsy, one foot behind the other, knees bent, skirt lifted just enough to prevent tripping, but not enough to seem indecent. It's a balancing act between grace and obedience. Do it well, and you pass unnoticed. Do it poorly, and you become a whispered cautionary tale in drawing rooms. One of the most absolute rules? Never turn your back on the queen. Not in a throne room, not in a corridor, not even when you finish speaking. The correct procedure is to retreat backward, slowly, carefully, until you've reached a respectful distance. Yes, this means that courtiers sometimes looked like clumsy dancers, backing out of rooms while trying not to collide with a chair, a servant, or one another. You may laugh, but better to bruise your elbow on a doorway than bruise your reputation before the monarch. And here's the cruel truth. One mistake could end your career. Bow too shallow, and you appear insolent. Speak too casually, and you are presumptuous. Forget to retreat properly, and you are remembered not as the promising young equerry, but as the fellow who turned his back on Her Majesty. In a system built on appearances, etiquette was your currency, and it spent faster than gold. Seating was another silent battlefield. In throne rooms, where levees and audiences took place, the queen sat elevated, often beneath a canopy, her chair larger, more ornate, and placed dead center. Every other chair in the room declared rank by its distance and orientation. The closer you were seated to the queen, the higher your importance. If you found yourself standing against the wall, you knew exactly where you stood, socially and politically. At state dinners, the table itself was a map of hierarchy. The queen sat at the center, with the most important guests flanking her left and right. Dukes, duchesses, ambassadors, generals, all placed with the precision of chess pieces. The further you were from the queen, the less influence you carried. A seat near the end of the table might as well come with a note: "Better luck next season." And don't even think about speaking across the table. Conversation moved in carefully orchestrated patterns, usually between immediate neighbors. This choreography of deference extended into daily life. Imagine walking into a palace room. Who speaks first? Not you. Who decides when the conversation ends? Not you. Your role is to respond, to nod, to agree with elegance. Even your posture mattered. Shoulders back, spine straight, eyes lowered just enough to suggest humility without appearing shifty. In fact, etiquette manuals of the time treated posture as a moral statement. A bowed head showed loyalty. A wandering gaze hinted at rebellion. If all this feels exhausting, you're starting to understand the point. The rules of deference weren't just about politeness. They were about control. They reminded everyone, from dukes to chambermaids, that power flowed in one direction. Even the smallest gestures carried heavy weight. A curtsy was never just a curtsy. It was a public admission of your place in the hierarchy. And sometimes, these rules could trip up even the most seasoned visitor. Consider foreign diplomats. Many arrived with their own traditions of deference, only to discover that what impressed one monarch enraged another. A bow too deep might seem mocking. One too shallow might appear insulting. The British court had no patience for improvisation. You were expected to learn, rehearse, and perform, flawlessly. Of course, the Queen herself knew the power of this system. Victoria was famously tiny in stature, but the weight of ritual made her presence immense. Surrounded by courtiers bowing, ladies curtsying, and ministers addressing her with trembling precision, she hardly needed to raise her voice. The rules did the work for her. Now imagine yourself in this world. You're waiting in the anteroom, heart thumping, shoes polished to a mirror shine. The chamberlain calls your name. You step forward, the air thick with expectation. Eyes are on you, measuring your bow, your words, your retreat. For a few seconds, you are part of the performance. Do it well, and you fade seamlessly back into the machinery, safe for another day. Do it poorly, and you are remembered forever, not for your deeds, but for your failure at the ritual of deference. And as you back carefully out of the room, trying not to trip over your own boots, you realize the palace is less about luxury than it is about choreography. A single gesture, a single phrase, even a single step can make or unmake you. So if you want to survive here, remember this: bow, curtsy, retreat. And never under any circumstances show the Queen your back, because vanish too completely and you'll be forgotten. That's exactly what happens when you listen without subscribing. The channel fades, the stories disappear, and history is erased twice. If the palace above stairs is a theater of grandeur, then below stairs is the stage crew working frantically in the dark. Only no applause ever reaches them. Here, you quickly learn that the true palace is not marble and chandeliers, but sweat, coal dust, and endless chores that begin before dawn and stretch far past midnight. You rise before the Queen. Of course you do. Someone has to light the fires before she opens her eyes. Imagine shuffling down cold stone corridors, carrying coal scuttles heavy enough to leave bruises on your shoulders. The grates must be cleared of yesterday's ashes, the firewood stacked, the flames coaxed into life, so that when Her Majesty wakes, her room is already warm. To her, comfort arrives like magic. To you, it comes at the price of blistered hands. Once the fires are lit, there's polishing. Always polishing. Brass handles, silver cutlery, banisters, door plates, anything that might, even for a moment, look less than dazzling. You polish until you can see your face in it, then polish some more. The palace thrives on the illusion of effortless luxury, and illusions require constant maintenance. And then there's the carpet rolling. Imagine this. Before a state event, every corridor is laid with rich carpet. After the guests leave, it's rolled up, beaten, shaken, stored, and then hauled out again the next time. Carpets are the great unsung actors of the palace, trodden on by boots worth more than your annual wages, and carried by your aching back when no one's looking. The work is divided with almost military precision. At the top, the glittering titles: Gold Stick in Waiting, Silver Stick in Waiting. These sound like medieval weapons, but in truth, they were ceremonial officers, remnants of an older court that still demanded its rituals. Equerries, dashing military men, attend to the Queen's personal service, carrying her messages, escorting her on rides, making themselves perpetually useful and impeccably visible. Then come the housemaids. They move like shadows through the rooms, armed with dusters and buckets, scrubbing, sweeping, and replacing chamber pots long before anyone noble stirs from bed. Their work is repetitive, thankless, and invisible by design. If a guest ever noticed a housemaid, it meant she had failed in her duty. Grooms of the chamber handle furniture, curtains, and candles. If the queen wants a room rearranged, chairs shifted, tables moved, curtains drawn differently, it is the grooms who appear silently, as if the furniture itself had developed legs. All of them, from the ceremonial sticks down to the scullery maids scrubbing greasy pans, exist to keep the machine humming. To be invisible was not an accident. It was a requirement. You were expected to glide in, complete the task, and vanish before anyone of rank noticed your presence. Loyalty was your other survival tool. Gossip was fatal. Mistakes were unforgivable. A dropped plate or spilled wine wasn't just clumsiness. It was a breach in the facade of royal perfection. A servant caught speaking too loudly, laughing at the wrong time, or, heaven forbid, speaking to the queen unprompted, risked instant dismissal. The palace could find another maid, another butler, another footman. It could not tolerate a crack in its illusion. And yet, below stairs had its own world. The servants' hall, where meals were taken, had its own hierarchy as rigid as the one above. Senior butlers and housekeepers sat at the head, footmen in the middle, scullery maids at the very bottom. Even here, rank ruled. A new maid might find herself ignored for weeks, tested with impossible chores, until she proved her obedience. Daily life blurred into routine. You rise, light fires, polish, serve, vanish. Hours slip past in a haze of footsteps, whispered instructions, and endless repetition. Yet sometimes, just sometimes, you glimpse the life above stairs. A flash of silk on a staircase, the sound of laughter from a drawing room, the shimmer of candlelight spilling through a half-open door. And you remember that you are not part of it. You are the one who carries it, like Atlas holding up the world. And still, there is pride. A strange, weary pride. Because while dukes and duchesses strut through corridors, their finery means nothing if the carpets aren't laid, the silver isn't shining, and the fires aren't lit. The palace exists because you keep it alive. You are both invisible and indispensable, erased yet essential. It's a cruel paradox. To succeed below stairs, you must disappear. But without you, the entire machine would grind to a halt. The queen might never admit it aloud, but her reign, her image, her daily comfort, all of it rests on the backs of servants like you. So, as you lay down your duster at the end of another endless day, you realize the truth. The palace may sparkle in the gaslight, but that brilliance is built on your silence, your loyalty, and your invisibility. Without you, the illusion collapses. With you, the world believes in the magic of monarchy. And tomorrow, you'll do it all again before dawn, because the queen's fires must never go cold. By now, you've seen the palace hierarchy and the endless invisible labor that keeps it alive. But the palace isn't just a machine. It's a clock. Every tick, every tock, every minute belongs to the monarch. And if you're inside these walls, your own time isn't yours anymore. It belongs to Queen Victoria. Her day begins early, and so does yours. At precisely 7:30, the palace stirs. Servants glide in silence to open shutters, draw curtains, and bring in hot water for washing. If you're on the early detail, you'll be balancing a jug of steaming water in one hand and a bundle of towels in the other, praying not to trip over the hem of the carpet. The queen isn't fond of excuses, and she certainly isn't fond of lateness. Victoria herself rises with remarkable regularity. She is no night owl. The bed is left behind promptly, prayers are murmured, and the first duties of the day begin. Letters from ministers arrive in tidy bundles, sometimes dozens at a time. If you're a private secretary, your morning isn't spent with tea and toast. It's spent standing quietly by her desk, ready to answer questions about state papers, draft responses, or fetch additional reports. Your role is to look invisible, but be instantly useful, like a book plucked from the right shelf. By 8 o'clock, breakfast is served. And when I say served, I mean choreographed like a ballet. The trays arrive hot, covered in silver domes that gleam so brightly they could blind you in the morning light. Eggs, toast, porridge, sometimes fish or chops. Hearty fuel for a woman who saw herself as both mother and monarch of an empire. But here's the catch. You don't sit down first. No one does. Not the servants laying the dishes, not the courtiers lingering nearby. You wait until she takes her seat. You wait until she lifts her fork, and only then does the rest of the palace breathe. Once breakfast is complete, the real work begins. Audiences, ministers, generals, ambassadors, all summoned to the Queen's presence, all made to wait in the dreaded ante-room. If you're unlucky enough to be one of them, you'll spend an hour staring at the same wallpaper, listening for the creak of the chamberlain's shoes as he finally ushers you in. Inside, you bow, present your papers, make your case. Outside, you wait again, because one audience could stretch to many, and the Queen had the luxury of never rushing. Meanwhile, her ladies-in-waiting orbit like moons. They read letters aloud, note her replies, fetch shawls, or simply sit in silence, ready at a glance to provide whatever is needed. Their presence is constant, their attention unwavering. You might envy them their silks and jewels, but their lives are as regimented as a soldier's, bound by the daily routine of royal service. Late morning often brought a carriage ride. Queen Victoria loved fresh air, though naturally, fresh air for her meant velvet cushions, polished wheels, and horses whose hooves clicked on the cobblestones in steady rhythm. If you're part of the escort, you ride alongside, watching the crowd. Some cheer, some bow, some simply stare in awe as the monarch rolls past. You're not just protecting a person, you're guarding an image. Luncheon followed, another carefully timed event. Meals weren't long, but they were precise. And remember the golden rule. No one eats after the Queen has finished. If she decides she's done after 5 minutes, you put down your fork. Hunger is secondary to etiquette. Afternoons might bring further audiences or official duties, signing papers, reading dispatches from India, reviewing military reports. But sometimes, if the mood allowed, there was painting or sketching. Victoria loved to draw, and while she relaxed with pen in hand, staff around her remained tense as bowstrings. The palace never relaxed, even when the Queen did. If you're a courtier, this is the hardest part of your day, the waiting. Endless hours in ante-rooms, corridors, side chambers, never knowing if you'll be summoned. You stand by fireplaces that never seem warm enough, balancing on aching feet, rehearsing in your head how you'll phrase your words if called. Will it be, "Your Majesty, might I suggest?" Or, "If it pleases your Majesty?" One misstep, and you may find yourself excluded from future invitations. Court life is not glamorous. It is a marathon of patience. By evening, the palace shifts gears. Dinner was the high point of the day, not because of the food, though the menus could stretch to dozens of courses, but because of what the dinner meant. It was a performance of power. Seating was a science. Dukes, duchesses, foreign dignitaries, all placed in strict order of precedence. You might spend weeks angling for a place near the Queen, only to find yourself exiled to the far end of the table where your conversation partner is some minor cousin of a baronet. And then, at last, the meal ends. The queen lays down her fork, and just like that, everyone else lays down theirs. Appetite is irrelevant. The performance is complete. After dinner, the men retire to smoking rooms, the women to drawing rooms, the rituals of gender splitting the company as neatly as a blade. You sip your port or you pour your tea, always mindful of posture, tone, and timing. For though the queen may be in another room, her presence lingers in the rules. The day winds down with final letters, a last audience, or perhaps an informal gathering. But even in relaxation, the clock ticks on. Lights are lowered, curtains drawn, guards take their posts for the night. If you're a servant, you're still awake. Clearing dishes, hauling away coal buckets, preparing fires for tomorrow morning. If you're a courtier, you collapse into bed, knowing you'll rise at the same hour tomorrow and the same hour the day after that. Palace time runs like clockwork. It does not bend for you. You bend for it. And as you drift into uneasy sleep, you realize the truth. The grandeur of monarchy is built not on crowns and jewels, but on routine. Relentless, repetitive, unforgiving routine. One missed step, one late arrival, and the entire rhythm falters. But so long as the palace beats on like a clock, the illusion of royal perfection never misses a second. By now you've adjusted to the rhythm of palace life. Or at least, you've learned not to trip over your own bow while backing out of a room. But nothing prepares you for the royal table. Meals in the palace weren't just for eating. They were performances. Carefully staged plays where every plate, every chair, and every flicker of candlelight carried meaning. Let's begin with the banquets. Imagine a dining table so long you can barely see the other end, covered in linen so white it hurts the eyes, ironed so flat you'd swear it had been pressed by angels. Upon it sits an army of tableware, goblets of gold, forks and knives polished until they gleam, dishes of silver stacked like soldiers on parade. Dozens of courses are planned: soups, roasts, puddings, pies, exotic fruits hauled in from across the empire. At one banquet in Windsor, the menu stretched so far it read more like a novella than a meal. But the food was almost secondary. What mattered most was timing. You never lifted your fork before the queen had begun. When she placed food upon her tongue, only then could you taste yours. And when she set down her fork, you had to set down yours too. Hunger did not matter. Etiquette did. If you happened to be enjoying your third bite of pheasant when Victoria finished hers, tough luck. Your plate might still be full, but the meal was over. The rules extended even to silence. No clattering of knives, no reaching across the table, no idle chatter unless it followed the proper pattern. Conversation was arranged like a dance. You spoke to the person on your right during the first course, then switched to the person on your left during the next. Stray from this pattern, and you risked being seen as ignorant, or worse, disrespectful. And then there was the seating. A banquet was not simply a dinner. It was a miniature map of empire. The queen sat in the middle, the heart of the arrangement. Closest to her, ambassadors, dukes, and visiting royalty. Further down, the lesser peers, the minor officials, the hopeful climbers. If you found yourself tucked away near the far end, next to a cousin of a viscount no one had heard of, you knew exactly what the court thought of your importance. A seat near the queen could elevate your fortunes. A seat in the shadows could quietly end them. Courtiers obsessed over placement. Weeks before a banquet, whispers would start. Will I be seated near Her Majesty? Will I be near the Prince of Wales, or am I doomed to the dull end of the table? People lobbied for positions, called in favors, even wrote letters begging for a better seat. And once the seating chart was revealed, fortunes rose and fell accordingly. It was less a meal and more a high-stakes political game disguised with fine china. And while all this grandeur unfolded above stairs, behind the scenes was a different world entirely. The palace kitchens were chaos disguised as order. Dozens of cooks and scullions darted around in the heat, preparing dishes to the exact minute. Fires roared, ovens smoked, pans clattered, knives chopped with frantic precision. The menus may have looked effortless when presented on silver trays, but the effort behind them was staggering. Imagine trying to serve 40 courses, each hot, perfectly seasoned, and identical for hundreds of guests, all without modern refrigeration or electric ovens. It was a miracle of logistics achieved on the sweat of countless backs. Servants carried dishes up narrow staircases, praying not to stumble. One slip, one overturned tray, and the illusion shattered. But they didn't get applause. At best, they went unnoticed. At worst, a single mistake could cost them their place. The nobility toasted their glasses while below stairs. A cook wrung his hands over whether the pudding had set in time. Of course, the queen herself didn't see this chaos. For her, the dishes arrived as if conjured by magic. She lifted her fork, she tasted, she paused, and the room froze with her. No one dared to be quicker. No one dared to linger longer. The queen's appetite dictated the appetite of the nation's elite. There's something almost comical about it, isn't there? Imagine sitting before a spread of delicacies, steaming venison, rich gravies, sugared fruits, and being forced to abandon them mid-bite because one woman has put down her fork. But that was the rule. And rules were the spine of the palace. Still, there was one advantage: the spectacle. For all its rigidity, a royal banquet was dazzling. The lights of chandeliers reflected off polished silver, the scent of roast meats mingled with perfumes, and the hum of polite conversation filled the air. Foreign guests left with memories not of taste, but of power. The food itself was secondary to the performance of empire. A reminder that Britain could summon pineapples in winter, serve ice in crystal bowls, and seat rulers from across the world at a single table. And you? Well, you sat where you were told, spoke when permitted, and ate only as long as the queen allowed. Your hunger mattered less than your obedience. The palace table was not about pleasure, it was about hierarchy, about knowing your place and staying in it, fork in hand, ready to drop it the instant Her Majesty did. And when the final dish was cleared, when the candles burned low and the queen rose from her seat, the banquet dissolved like mist. Guests stood, chairs scraped, courtiers bowed. The performance was over, and you filed out knowing that tomorrow the whole act could begin again. Because in the palace, even dinner was theater, and you weren't the star. You were just another actor, hoping not to forget your lines. If you think growing up in a palace meant endless toys, freedom, and laughter echoing down gilded corridors, think again. Childhood here was less about playing with marbles and more about rehearsing your role as a living symbol of empire. Royal children weren't raised like ordinary children. They were trained with the kind of discipline most modern boot camps would find excessive. From the moment you could stand, posture was everything. Shoulders back, chin level, eyes forward. Slouching wasn't just sloppy, it was dangerous. A crooked back in the nursery could mean a crooked reputation in the throne room. Governesses circled like hawks, adjusting your stance, correcting your gait, reminding you that even a toddler could represent the crown. Poorly, if you weren't careful. Education began early, and it never stopped. You weren't merely expected to read and write. You were drilled in languages, French, German, sometimes Latin or Greek if your tutors were feeling ambitious. Your penmanship had to be exquisite, your arithmetic precise, your geography flawless. But more than anything, you were taught etiquette, how to bow or curtsy without wobbling, how to address each rank correctly, how to sit at table without spilling soup or looking like a child, even though, of course, you were one. And make no mistake, governesses ruled your world. They were not warm, grandmotherly figures telling bedtime stories. They were stern, sharp-eyed disciplinarians with an arsenal of punishments at their disposal. Forgetting a verb conjugation in French, you might lose playtime. Talking back, expect an icy silence that could chill a room warmer than any fireplace. Worst of all was breaking the rule of silence. Royal children were not to interrupt, not to chatter, not to demand attention. You were trained to be silent until spoken to, a skill that looks elegant in portraits, but feels suffocating in childhood. Play, when it was permitted, was restricted. A ball might be allowed in the garden, provided you didn't scuff your shoes. Dolls could be dressed and redressed, though even that sometimes doubled as practice for the clothing etiquette you'd need later in life. Spontaneity was discouraged. Climbing trees, chasing each other through corridors, shouting. These belonged to ordinary children. You, as a royal child, played carefully, quietly, always aware that someone was watching, and someone was always watching. Governesses hovered, tutors lingered, servants moved silently in and out, eyes lowered but ears sharp. Even in supposed privacy, you were on display. Every gesture was recorded, every outburst noted, every mistake reported. Privacy was a luxury you could never afford. Public appearances were the final test. You may have only been 6 years old, but in public you were expected to behave like a miniature adult. Smile at the right moment, bow at the right angle, never squirm, never frown. In portraits, you held still for hours, painted not as a child at play, but as a symbol of lineage, dressed in lace or velvet, staring solemnly into history's gaze. And heaven help you if you disobeyed. Queen Victoria was famously devoted to her children, but she was equally devoted to discipline. She expected obedience, not indulgence. Her letters reveal a mother deeply concerned with manners, with duty, with shaping each child into a proper royal figure. Affection existed, but it was never allowed to eclipse expectation. You might get a hug. You would definitely get a lecture. The contradiction was sharp. You lived in palaces with ceilings painted like the heavens, gardens sprawling farther than most villages, and wardrobes filled with silks and satins. And yet, your day was scheduled to the minute, your actions controlled, your words rehearsed. In many ways, you had less freedom than the child of a shopkeeper who could at least run wild in the street. The governesses enforced this with near military precision. Lessons began promptly. Meals were timed. Even play breaks were supervised and structured. You were taught loyalty, deference, and self-control, not joy. A temper tantrum wasn't simply childish misbehavior. It was treated as a crack in the imperial facade. You weren't just embarrassing yourself. You were embarrassing the monarchy. By adolescence, the training deepened. Boys were groomed for military or governmental service. They learned strategy, history, the art of command. Girls were trained for marriage alliances, languages polished, music lessons enforced, needlework perfected. They were rehearsed into becoming living gifts for foreign thrones, bargaining chips in the game of dynastic politics. Love, as you might imagine, was not the point. But for all its severity, this upbringing did achieve its goal. The royal children grew into adults who could perform royalty as naturally as breathing. They bowed without thinking, sat upright without effort, endured hours of ceremony without complaint. They became living symbols, carrying on the machine of monarchy as their parents intended. Still, one wonders what they lost along the way. The laughter that never echoed down the corridors, the scraped knees never earned in wild play, the friendships denied because they might have been inappropriate. In the palace, even childhood was sacrificed to ritual. So if you imagine yourself as a royal child, don't picture freedom. Picture discipline. Picture a governess's sharp eyes catching you mid-slouch. Picture rehearsing your curtsy again and again until your knees ache. Picture silence when you long to shout, and stillness when your legs ache to run. Childhood here was not childhood at all. It was training, relentless, unyielding, and lifelong. And as you close your lesson book for the evening, posture perfect, eyes lowered, you realize something. In the palace, you never grow up. You only grow into your role. If you've ever thought it would be glamorous to serve as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Victoria, let's put that fantasy to rest. Yes, there are silks and jewels. Yes, there are grand halls, gilded mirrors, and invitations to events that ordinary mortals could only dream of. But glamour, in reality, was rationed. What you got in its place was endless rules, strict dress codes, and the privilege of never having a day, or even an hour, entirely to yourself. Being a lady-in-waiting meant living in constant readiness. You were tethered to the Queen's schedule like a shadow, summoned whenever needed, no matter the hour. The bell might ring at midnight, or in the middle of a rainstorm, or just when you finally sat down to enjoy a quiet letter from home. One moment you're dozing. The next you're fastening your gown in the half-light, hurrying through cold corridors to hold a shawl, fetch a glass of water, or listen patiently to Her Majesty's thoughts on a dull dispatch. Sleep, privacy, and preference were luxuries you left at the palace gates. Even your clothing wasn't your own. Forget experimenting with the latest Parisian fashion or wearing colors that suited your complexion. Court rules dictated your wardrobe, down to the smallest detail. White gloves for this, black lace for that, certain silks forbidden during mourning, certain gowns mandated for ceremonies. Skirts had to be of a certain cut, jewelry of a certain restraint. You weren't dressing for yourself. You were dressing to extend the Queen's image. One incorrect choice and whispers would ripple through the court faster than spilled wine across a tablecloth. But the rules of fabric were nothing compared to the rules of deference. Around the Queen, you never relaxed. You stood when she entered, curtsied with precision, and never spoke first. If she joked, you laughed. If she frowned, you smoothed your face into sympathy. If she was in one of her darker moods, which, to put it mildly, she often was, your task was to absorb the storm without complaint. Imagine the emotional gymnastics, staying calm, supportive, invisible, and yet entirely present. It was less a job and more an endurance sport. And here's the thing. You weren't just serving the Queen. You were serving the court itself. You were a bridge between Victoria and the nobles, smoothing disputes before they ever reached her. A countess muttering about precedents at dinner? You listened, soothed, and gently guided her back into line. A baroness sulking about her seat at a concert? You found a way to flatter her into silence. The queen didn't have time for petty quarrels, but you did. Your role was part companion, part diplomat, part emotional sponge. There were, of course, lighter duties. Reading aloud to the queen was common. Novels, sermons, political tracts, even her own letters when her eyes grew tired. Holding her yarn while she knitted, joining her in sketching sessions, accompanying her on walks or carriage rides, keeping her conversation lively, or at least steady. You became the soundtrack of her daily life, filling in the silences when she wished, retreating into quiet when she didn't. But don't mistake that for friendship. Queen Victoria valued loyalty fiercely, but she also demanded obedience. A lady-in-waiting could be dismissed as swiftly as she was appointed. Affection was possible, yes, but conditional. The hierarchy never blurred. You might share laughter, even tears, but you remained in orbit around her, never her equal. This closeness, however, gave you power of a peculiar kind. You saw the queen unguarded, in her irritations, her griefs, her private joys. You knew which ministers bored her, which children troubled her, which diplomats made her roll her eyes. That knowledge was currency. A word from you, a subtle suggestion, a gentle nudge at the right moment, it could shape perceptions, even policies. And so, while the men of Parliament roared and debated, the ladies-in-waiting whispered and smoothed, exerting influence in the quiet corridors where true intimacy lay. Yet with that came suspicion. Other courtiers eyed you carefully, measuring how close you were, how much the queen leaned on you. Too close, and you were envied. Too distant, and you were useless. It was a delicate balance, a dance of being essential without being threatening, devoted without being desperate. And then there was the toll. Imagine years of this life, standing, curtsying, smiling, soothing. Your own desires muted, your own time swallowed. Letters from home left unopened because duty called. Friendships strained because you were always at the palace. Even marriage prospects could be delayed or lost, since your availability belonged not to a suitor, but to the queen. It was loyalty that cost you your own life, lived second-hand in service of another's. Still, many accepted it gladly. Why? Because proximity to the queen meant proximity to power. A lady-in-waiting might lack formal authority, but her presence carried weight. To be known as close to Her Majesty was a badge of honor, one that elevated families, secured influence, and brought a kind of prestige money couldn't buy. For many noblewomen, that was worth every sleepless night, every sore knee from repeated curtsies, every whisper of gossip behind fans. So imagine yourself in that role. You rise, already tired, dress according to rules not of your choosing, and prepare for another day of waiting. The queen may need you to carry her letters, to ease her temper, to smile when she cannot. At dinner, you watch the seating politics unfold, always alert, always smoothing tensions before they rise. At night, you half sleep, ears open for the bell that might ring, summoning you to the royal bedside. And in all of this, you are never quite yourself. You are a fragment of the queen, a reflection, an extension. To serve her was to surrender a part of your own identity, to become an instrument of her will, her moods, her daily rhythm. Glamorous? Occasionally. Exhausting? Always. But such was life for a lady-in-waiting, Bound by silks that weren't her choice, caught in rituals that weren't her making, she lived a life of constant readiness. Her loyalty was unending, her visibility conditional, her power fragile. And yet, without her, even the mighty Queen Victoria would have found her days far harder to manage. Because behind every monarch sat not just a throne, but a small army of women holding shawls, fetching glasses of water, and smiling at midnight when they'd rather be anywhere else. And that's the fate of this channel if you don't subscribe. Always working in the shadows, essential but forgotten. Now let's shift the gaze from the silks and curtsies of the ladies to the polished boots and stiff collars of the men. The gentlemen of Queen Victoria's court were a peculiar breed, half servants, half aristocrats, and entirely trapped in a world where every bow, every button, every pause in conversation was freighted with meaning. You might imagine them as dashing figures, striding confidently through marble corridors, swords clinking at their sides. But the truth was far less cinematic. Life as a gentleman of the court was about precision, not panache. Every detail of your dress, your manner, your speech, and even your silence was scrutinized. To survive here, you needed not only polish, literally and figuratively, but the ability to blend ambition with invisibility. Start with the equerries. These were military men assigned to attend the Queen, drawn from respectable regiments and chosen as much for their appearance as their competence. An equerry wasn't just an officer, he was a prop in the ongoing performance of monarchy. You accompanied the Queen on rides, managed her carriages, carried messages, and stood discreetly behind her chair during audiences. You were visible enough to suggest strength, but quiet enough never to distract. Think of it as being a human ornament, gleaming, upright, ready to serve, but never the focus of attention. Then there were the advisors and private secretaries. They were the true workhorses of court life, buried under piles of letters and reports, standing long hours with dispatch boxes at the ready. These men had access to the Queen's ear, but at a cost. They could not ramble, they could not flatter too obviously, and they certainly could not contradict without exquisite tact. Their power came from proximity, not independence. They were like chess pieces positioned close to the Queen, dangerous if moved wisely, vulnerable if handled poorly. And of course there were the court uniforms. Gentlemen could not simply roll out of bed, toss on a coat, and declare themselves ready for duty. Dress codes were rigid. Frock coats for some occasions, breeches and silk stockings for others. Court uniforms came adorned with gold embroidery, sashes, and medals pinned so tightly to the chest you could barely breathe. Military men often rattled with decorations, every medal a reminder of empire, conquest, and loyalty. If you lacked real medals, you polished the few you had until they gleamed like suns. To appear shabby or underdressed was to risk humiliation. A single unshined button could spark whispers that you lacked respect for the throne. But clothing was only the first hurdle. Speech was even trickier. Around the Queen, you didn't simply chat. You spoke only when spoken to. Imagine standing in a room, bursting with something witty, clever, or even essential to say, and holding it back because protocol demanded silence until the monarch addressed you. Entire careers were derailed by careless words spoken too quickly or too casually. If you were wise, you rehearsed answers in your head, perfecting phrases like, "Yes, Your Majesty," or "As you please, ma'am," and leaving your true thoughts for the private safety of corridors. And oh, those corridors. That was where the real court operated. not in the throne rooms or banqueting halls, but in the liminal spaces in between. Gentlemen lingered in hallways, exchanged glances, whispered alliances, hinted at favors. A comment dropped casually by the fireplace could ripple all the way to Parliament if passed through the right mouths. Networking wasn't conducted with handshakes and contracts. It was played like a card game, subtle and coded. Who you stood beside, who you avoided, who you greeted with a nod, all carried weight. If you imagine yourself as one of these gentlemen, picture this. You rise early, uniform crisp, boots polished so brightly you can see your anxious face in them. You stand in ante-rooms for hours, waiting for the Queen to summon you. When she does, you bow, you wait, you respond carefully. You might escort her on a ride, manage her horses, or stand silently as she signs papers. Later, in corridors, you try to strike up quiet conversations with other courtiers, always mindful that any word could be repeated, twisted, or exaggerated by rivals. Ambition here is a tightrope. Lean too far forward, and you tumble into disgrace, accused of being too pushy. Lean too far back, and you fade into irrelevance. The trick is to hover, present but not overbearing, useful but not indispensable, respectful but not sycophantic. It's a balancing act that leaves most men perpetually exhausted. And don't forget the physical toll. Court uniforms may have looked grand, but they were hardly comfortable. Starched collars choked your neck. Tight breeches restricted movement. The weight of medals and embroidery left shoulders aching. You might look magnificent under the chandeliers, but beneath the fabric you were sweating, stiff and sore. Appearances, as always in the palace, came before comfort. Still, there was no denying the allure. To be a gentleman of the court meant proximity to power. And proximity was everything. You heard whispers of politics before they reached the newspapers. You saw the Queen's reactions to ministers' proposals before the nation ever did. You were inside the machinery, close enough to sense the shifting currents of influence. If you played your cards right, your career could soar. If you played them poorly, you could vanish without a trace, replaced by the next eager officer in line. And so you performed, day after day, night after night, in stiff collars, measured bows, and carefully chosen silences. For the gentlemen of the court, life was not about glory. It was about endurance. About waiting in corridors, polishing your boots, rehearsing your words, and mastering the art of being visible without ever outshining the Queen. Because here in the palace, the men of rank were not free agents. They were carefully placed ornaments in the grand theater of monarchy, polished, disciplined, and silently aware that one wrong move could send them tumbling from the stage. By now, you've learned the rules of deference, the grind of service, the routines of royalty. But now comes the true centerpiece of palace life, the dinner and the banquet. Don't mistake these for ordinary meals. They were not about feeding hunger. They were about feeding power. A stage performance where every fork, every laugh, every morsel reinforced the hierarchy of the empire. Picture the scene. The long dining hall glows with candlelight. Chandeliers drip crystal overhead. Mirrors reflect the gleam of gold and silver, and a table stretches farther than you can comfortably see. At its center, beneath a canopy, or simply at the place of honor, sits Queen Victoria. Around her, the chairs are filled not at random, but according to ceremonial seating, the most meticulous game of musical chairs you've ever witnessed. To her right, perhaps, an ambassador from Prussia. To her left, a powerful duke. Further along, Princes, princesses, earls, foreign dignitaries, all arranged in an order that is part etiquette, part politics. If you're lucky, you find yourself in the upper half of the table, within easy earshot of the Queen. If not, you might be exiled to the far end, where the candlelight grows dim and the company grows decidedly dull. Placement was no accident. Where you sat announced to the entire room how important you were, or weren't. Once seated, the rules tightened. Forget modern informality. You do not laugh too loudly. You do not interrupt. You do not, under any circumstances, season your food. To sprinkle salt or pepper was a silent insult to the chef, implying that the dish Her Majesty had approved was inadequate. Better to swallow blandness than to risk a faux pas. Conversation was equally restricted. You didn't chat idly about the weather or your aching feet. No, you engaged in safe conversation, remarks about music, art, perhaps polite admiration of the Queen's jewels, or an anecdote about the countryside. Politics, scandal, or anything resembling genuine opinion was strictly off limits. And if you're thinking this sounds stiff and humorless, you're right. But that was the point. These dinners weren't about fun. They were about reinforcing the image of order, refinement, and control. A single misplaced word, a single awkward pause, could echo louder than a dozen toasts. You weren't there to enjoy yourself. You were there to survive. Now look down at your plate. Exotic dishes parade across the table, carried in by liveried footmen. Game birds, rich meats, elaborate puddings, ices carved into delicate shapes, pineapples in the dead of winter, imported wines from France, spices from India, sugar from the Caribbean. Every dish a reminder that the empire's reach was vast enough to supply the Queen with whatever delicacy she desired. These weren't just courses. They were edible propaganda. But as you lift your fork, remember the golden rule. No one begins until the Queen does. And when she stops, you stop. If she has finished after 3 bites, your 20 remaining are whisked away untouched. Appetite bends to etiquette. Hunger is secondary to hierarchy. You may feel cheated as a tray of uneaten pheasant vanishes, but that was the system. The Queen sets the rhythm, and you keep pace. All the while, servants scurry in near silence. Their footsteps are muffled by carpets, their hands swift as they refill glasses and clear plates. The entire machinery of the meal depends on them, yet they remain unseen. The nobility dine on exotic fruits. The servants may eat only scraps left over at the end of the night. The contrast could not be sharper. Above the table, a performance of empire. Below the stairs, exhaustion and hunger. And yet, this system dazzled. Foreign ambassadors often left in awe. They carried stories back to their own courts of glittering banquets, flawless service, endless courses. They saw not the sweat of the kitchens, not the aching backs of the footmen, but the illusion. Britain as a nation of order, elegance, and inexhaustible wealth. A pineapple on the Queen's table was more than a fruit. It was a political message. Look what our empire can deliver. If you were a middle-ranking courtier, these dinners were agony. Too far from the Queen to matter, too close to the bottom to feel secure. You smiled, nodded, and tried to make small talk with the neighbor fate had assigned you. Perhaps a dull cousin of an earl, perhaps an obscure baronet who spoke only of his hunting dogs. Meanwhile, you watched the higher ranks lean toward the Queen, basking in her attention. Every laugh, every nod from her was currency. You had none, and you knew it. And when the final toast was raised, when glasses clinked politely, and the Queen rose from her seat, the banquet ended as abruptly as it began. Conversation halted, chairs scraped back, and the entire company rose with her. Whatever hunger remained, whatever half-finished stories lingered on your tongue, were left behind. The performance was over. Meanwhile, behind the grand doors, the kitchens heaved with chaos. Cooks collapsed onto benches, wiping sweat from their brows. Scullery maids scoured pans blackened with grease. Fires burned low, scraps were gathered, and exhausted servants finally caught their breath. For them, the evening had been a battle, waged with ladles and knives, fought on the clock, all to sustain the illusion of effortless grandeur above. And you, guest or servant alike, left with the same understanding. Palace dinners were never about food. They were about theater, a performance of empire that dazzled those above, drained those below, and reminded everyone in between of their precise place in the order of things. So as you file out into the dim corridors, stomach half full and ears buzzing with polite chatter, remember this: the meal was not for you. It was for the monarchy, for the empire, for the carefully maintained image that kept the machine running. And tomorrow, the table would be set again, the seating chart rewritten, the servants summoned. The show never truly ended. It only paused between courses. Dinner is done. The plates have been cleared, the wine decanters carted off, and the candles burned halfway down. But don't think the evening is over. In the palace, mealtime was only Act 1. Act 2 began the moment the queen rose from her chair, and it played out, not around a dining table, but in the drawing rooms. And here's where the choreography becomes truly absurd: the grand separation of the sexes. One door for the men, another for the women, as if you'd suddenly stumbled into a schoolroom rather than the heart of an empire. It was tradition, and in the palace, tradition was law. If you are a gentleman, you follow the Prince of Wales or one of the senior dukes into the smoking room. The air thickens immediately, heavy with the smell of cigars. Glasses of port are passed around, decanters clink on mahogany, and the conversation turns quickly to politics, diplomacy, and the endless shuffling of empire. Maps may be spread, treaties debated, scandals hinted at in low voices. This was where influence truly grew its roots, not at the dinner table, where everyone was on their best behavior, but here, behind a haze of smoke, where words could slip looser, deals could be struck, and enemies quietly measured. If you're clever, you say very little. You nod gravely, you sip slowly, and you listen. Because in this room, silence could be more valuable than speech. Too much talk and you reveal yourself as a fool. Too little and you fade into irrelevance. The game is in the balance. Speak just enough to show wit, never enough to betray weakness. And whatever you do, don't cough. No one likes the man who chokes on his cigar. Meanwhile, if you're a lady, you are led into the drawing room. No smoke here, at least not the pungent kind. Instead, the air smells of polished wood, perfume, and needlework. The queen settles into a chair. Ladies in waiting arrange themselves gracefully, and soon the routine begins. Perhaps someone plays the piano, filling the room with Chopin or Mendelssohn. Perhaps a young noblewoman takes up her embroidery, the needle glinting in the candlelight. Conversation hums softly, restrained and polite, circling around safe topics: music, travel, family. No politics, no negotiations, no risky opinions. On the surface, it looks serene. Women smiling, heads bent together, a ripple of laughter here, a murmur there. But don't be fooled. This room, too, is a theater. Every laugh is measured, every remark calibrated. You are being judged on your poise, your wit, your charm. Too loud, and you appear vulgar. Too quiet, and you seem dull. You are, in effect, auditioning for your place in the social hierarchy with every word you utter and every stitch you make. The separation itself carried symbolism. Men with cigars embodied public power, politics, empire, the supposed serious business of the realm. Women with music and embroidery embodied domestic grace, refinement, culture, the art of being seen but not heard in matters of state. Never mind that the queen herself, sitting in the middle of the drawing room, ruled over half the globe. The ritual division of the sexes reinforced the idea that men governed and women beautified, even when the woman on the throne could overrule them all. If you're observant, though, you'll notice that the drawing room wasn't always as tranquil as it looked. Rivalries simmered beneath the lace and laughter. A duchess might shoot a glance across the room at a countess she despised. Two ladies might compete for the queen's ear, offering anecdotes in turn, their smiles sharper than their needles. The embroidery hoops and sheet music masked currents of envy, ambition, and subtle manipulation. The men may have thought they had the monopoly on politics, but politics thrived here too, just in quieter tones. Back in the smoking room, matters were less subtle. Voices rose, glasses refilled, cigar smoke thickened until the walls seemed to breathe with it. Old battles were rehashed, new alliances floated. Ministers angled for favor, generals dropped hints about promotions, foreign envoys suggested terms. The men prided themselves on their seriousness, yet much of it was bluster, puffed up as thickly as the smoke in their lungs. Meanwhile, the queen might call for the ladies to sing. Imagine standing in a circle, voice trembling slightly as you perform an aria before your monarch, knowing that every note is judged, not only by her, but by the entire company. Your voice wasn't simply music. It was another way of proving your breeding, your polish, your worthiness. And so the hours drifted on. Men smoked and schemed. Women played, embroidered, and performed poise. The ritual was as old as court itself, a division that reassured everyone that order was maintained, that gender roles remained intact, that nothing in the palace truly changed, even as the world outside transformed with steam engines, telegraphs, and revolutions. If you are honest with yourself, it's dull. The men's smoke gives you a headache. The women's embroidery numbs your fingers. You long for fresh air, for laughter unmeasured, for a moment of truth instead of endless performance. But in the palace, truth is rare. Ritual is everything. You smile, you sip, you stitch, you bow. You play your part until the queen decides the evening is done. At last, near midnight, the ritual dissolves. The men rejoin the women, the queen rises, and the gathering breaks apart. Courtiers retreat to their chambers, servants slip in to tidy the remains, and silence settles over the palace once again. Another day, another performance complete. And as you drift to bed, one thought lingers. After-dinner rituals weren't about pleasure or conversation or even relaxation. They were about reinforcement, a nightly reminder that in the palace, roles were fixed, order was eternal, and everyone had their place. By now you've seen that nothing in the palace happens by accident. Not the way you walk, not the way you sit, not even the way you eat. And love, if you dare call it that, is no exception. Courtship in the palace wasn't about fluttering hearts or stolen kisses in moonlit gardens. It was about alliances, dynasties, and strategy. Think less Romeo and Juliet, more spreadsheet of European bloodlines. If you're a young woman of rank, your marriage isn't your decision. It's a project. Your family studies the chessboard of Europe and decides where you might best fit. A duke's son in Prussia? Perhaps. A cousin of the Tsar? Tempting. Some minor German prince who has good land but no charm? Likely. Your value isn't measured in affection, but in how your union strengthens bloodlines, secures treaties, or elevates the family name. And don't think you'll meet your suitor in some spontaneous romantic encounter. Every introduction is orchestrated. Every glance across the ballroom is monitored. You are never left alone. Always chaperoned, always observed, always reminded that your behavior reflects not only on yourself, but on your entire family, and by extension, the monarchy. A whisper of scandal could derail months of careful planning. So how did courtship happen? Subtly. You signal through dances, through glances, through the flutter of a fan. At a ball, you might be permitted a waltz with a potential suitor, the only time you're allowed prolonged physical contact. And even then, the room watches, your parents, your governess, the queen herself. A single misstep, a too long gaze, a laugh at the wrong moment could be interpreted as either interest or impropriety. Courtship was a language of symbols, and you were expected to be fluent. The fan itself was practically a dictionary. Open it slowly, and it suggests one thing. Snap it shut, another. Hold it against your cheek, and you're sending a coded message across the room. Every flick of your wrist became part of a silent dialogue, monitored by mothers and matchmakers who knew the code as well as you did. For the men, the rules weren't much easier. A young nobleman seeking marriage had to present himself carefully, polite but not overeager, ambitious but not greedy, respectful but not dull. He courted not just the girl, but her entire family, sometimes half of Europe, if the union was significant enough. A bouquet of flowers or a polite remark wasn't just a gesture of affection. It was a calculated move in a much larger game. And don't think love was absent. It sometimes managed to sneak in. But it was always secondary, always fragile, always precarious. Marriages made for politics could blossom into affection, yes, but more often they settled into duty. If you dreamed of marrying for passion, you quickly learned that passion was for novels, not for palaces. If you imagine yourself at such a courtship, picture this. You're standing in a glittering ballroom, chandeliers blazing overhead. Music swells as couples swirl across the floor. You feel the brush of a hand against yours. Brief, fleeting, but electric in its rarity. You exchange a glance just long enough to suggest interest, not long enough to spark gossip. Later, perhaps, you speak a few words in a drawing room, with half a dozen eyes watching. That's as close as you come to intimacy. Meanwhile, the real negotiations are happening elsewhere. Fathers and uncles, mothers and aunts, ministers and monarchs, all discussing dowries, estates, titles, and succession. You are less the architect of your fate than the foundation stone in someone else's construction project. And when the match is finally made, the announcement isn't romantic. It's official. A proclamation, a celebration, a sigh of relief from families who have secured their alliances. The wedding itself is a spectacle of symbolism. Vows taken before hundreds of eyes, processions down aisles, uniforms, gowns, jewels. Less about love than about displaying continuity and power. For you, the newly married, the reality might be sobering. You may find yourself in a strange country, speaking a foreign language, sharing a life with someone you barely know. Your duty is to bear children, manage households, represent your family with dignity. Your personal desires, those are secondary. You are now part of the machinery of dynasty. And yet, for all its coldness, courtship at court fascinated outsiders. Writers romanticized the rituals. Painters immortalized the dances. The public devoured every rumor of a match. A royal engagement was national news. A royal wedding practically a public holiday. The people saw fairy tales. The participants lived obligations. So if you find yourself daydreaming about palace romance, let me remind you, it wasn't about roses and whispered poetry. It was about fans flicking at just the right moment, dances conducted under heavy scrutiny, and families quietly pulling the strings. Courtship at court was less about hearts, more about thrones. And as you curtsy at the end of the ball, careful to hold your gaze for precisely 3 seconds and no more, you realize the truth. Love in the palace was never entirely yours. It belonged to history, to dynasty, to duty. And you? You were simply the player chosen to make the next move. Ignore subscribing, and you're left off the dance floor entirely, watching history waltz on without you. You might think that in a palace filled with powerful personalities, conflict would be loud, shouting matches in corridors, slammed doors, or public confrontations that echoed off marble walls. But no, this was not the marketplace, or the battlefield, or even parliament. In the palace, conflict was a much quieter beast. It thrived not in raised voices, but in carefully measured silences. Disputes here were fought with icy politeness, daggers disguised as smiles, and reputations sliced apart with nothing sharper than etiquette. If you imagine yourself stepping into this world, prepare to trade in your sword for a fan and your shield for a bow. Your greatest weapon isn't volume, it's restraint. A raised eyebrow could wound more deeply than an insult, and a withheld invitation could devastate more effectively than a duel. Consider the letters. In ordinary households, disagreements might be resolved face to face. But in the palace, letters were the preferred medium of complaint. They were formal, documented, and most importantly, indirect. Instead of shouting at a fellow courtier, you composed a note dripping with politeness. It grieves me to observe that certain precedences have not been observed, or it would, of course, be most agreeable if in future arrangements proper respect might be shown. Every word chosen with surgical precision, every phrase designed to sting while cloaked in courtesy. You didn't accuse, you regretted. You didn't demand, you requested with sorrow. And because letters could be copied, archived, and passed around, each one became both a weapon and a record, proof of your grievance carefully etched in ink. But the real battlefield was the palace itself. Rooms, invitations, and seating arrangements became weapons in these silent wars. Imagine being pointedly excluded from a gathering in the green drawing room, a clear sign you had fallen out of favor. Or worse, imagine being invited, but placed at the farthest corner of the table, miles from the queen's gaze, your rank silently diminished. To be kept waiting in an anteroom just a little too long was no accident. It was strategy. You weren't forgotten. You were being reminded of your place. Factions formed too, though never openly. You wouldn't see banners waving or alliances declared. Instead, you'd notice clusters of courtiers who always seemed to sit together, whisper together, support each other's complaints in letters or subtle gestures. These factions weren't loud, but they were powerful. They controlled invitations, spread whispers, and carefully cultivated reputations. To find yourself outside a faction was to find yourself vulnerable, your every move scrutinized by rivals eager for you to stumble. And then there were the wars of reputation. In the palace, character assassination never looked like gossip in a tavern. It looked like etiquette. A rival might accidentally omit your title when introducing you, reducing your dignity before an audience. A letter might circulate hinting that your manners were perhaps not of the highest refinement. A rival hostess might seat you beside someone dull or insignificant, ensuring you were remembered for boredom rather than brilliance. The weapons were subtle, but the wounds lasted. What made it worse was that you were rarely allowed to retaliate openly, to shout, to show temper, to protest too strongly. All of these would mark you as uncouth, unfit for the refined world of court. The challenge was to endure insult with a smile, to answer slight with serenity, to wound back with equal subtlety. You lived in a constant cold war, where every interaction was a move on the board and no one could ever admit the game existed. Picture yourself in this world. You arrive at a reception, smiling, curtsying, bowing, and then you notice it. Your rival has been given a seat closer to the queen. She glances at you, ever so slightly triumphant, while pretending not to notice at all. You laugh politely with the person beside you, but inside you're seething. Later you compose a letter. It was, of course, a delightful evening, though some arrangements did seem most unusual. With that carefully chosen phrase, you've both registered your complaint and planted a seed of doubt. And the queen herself? She was not blind to these wars. She read the letters, she noticed the factions, and sometimes she let them play out, perhaps amused, perhaps exasperated, but always aware. In a sense, these disputes reinforced her authority. While courtiers squabbled over precedents and invitations, she remained the immovable center, the one person whose power was beyond question. For the servants below stairs, the conflicts above were a source of bafflement. While they scrubbed floors, hauled coal, and carried trays, they watched nobles nearly collapse with outrage over seating charts. To them, these wars seemed absurd. Battles fought not with sweat and labor, but with feathers and ink. Yet even servants knew that one whispered word, one misplaced smile, could alter the fortunes of entire families. The strangest part of palace conflict was its silence. Imagine walking into a room where everyone smiles at you. Too much. The temperature feels just a little colder. The laughter dies the moment you enter. No one says anything outright, but you know you're on the outside. It's the kind of hostility that chills without ever raising its voice, and it wore you down. The endless vigilance, the constant awareness that any misstep could be twisted into scandal. You rehearsed not just your bows and curtsies, but your very emotions. Anger must be disguised as amusement, irritation as composure, ambition as humility. Every day was a performance, and the price of failure was exclusion. The most devastating punishment in a world where visibility was survival. So if you're imagining palace life as glittering and carefree, remember this. Behind the chandeliers and the music, there were battles fought every day, not with armies, but with invitations, not with bullets, but with whispers, not with courage, but with restraint. Conflict in the palace was never about noise. It was about silence, sharp, strategic, and suffocating. And as you retreat from the drawing room tonight, smile fixed firmly in place, you realize the truth. Survival here requires not bravery, but subtlety. Not the courage to fight, but the patience to endure. Because in the palace, no one wins an argument by shouting. They win it by smiling as they slide the knife in. By now, you've seen the palace as a clock, a theater, a machine of endless etiquette. But here's another role it played: a church. Not literally, of course, though the chapels were splendid enough, but in spirit. For religion at court wasn't just a matter of faith, it was ritual, performance, and above all, a tool of authority. Each day began with prayers, not the mumbled, half-asleep kind you might remember from your childhood, but structured devotions led by palace chaplains. These weren't simply for the Queen's private comfort, though Victoria did hold her faith dearly. They were also a signal to the court. Monarchy and morality marched together. If you served the Queen, you began your day with the sound of Scripture. Chaplains themselves were fixtures of the palace, learned men in crisp robes, moving quietly but purposefully through the halls. Their sermons were measured, their voices carefully pitched. They weren't fire-breathing preachers railing against sin. They were scholars of propriety, gently reminding everyone that duty to God reinforced duty to crown. The two were braided together like threads in a tapestry. To fail in one was to weaken the other. And then there was church attendance, the most public ritual of all. On Sundays, the Queen appeared at chapel, accompanied by her family and an entourage of courtiers. The congregation included the highest of the nobility, arrayed in their finery, each glance and gesture carefully monitored. To be absent was unthinkable. Miss church, and tongues wagged. Miss twice, and whispers found their way into Parliament. Faith here wasn't about saving your soul. It was about preserving your reputation. Imagine it. You're seated in the chapel pews, posture impeccable, voice raised in hymn. But you're not really concentrating on the words. You're watching who is late, who sings too softly, who fidgets, who dares glance away while the Queen kneels. Everything is observed, everything interpreted. Did Lord so-and-so cough during the sermon? Perhaps he was signaling boredom with the chaplain. Did Lady such-and-such fail to curtsy deeply enough as she entered? Perhaps her loyalty was slipping. At court, even faith was political. Religion at court was less about theology than about performance. A monarch was expected to embody moral leadership. If Victoria prayed, the court prayed. If she wept during a hymn, the act was read as both sincerity and symbolism. The Queen wasn't just another worshiper. She was the head of a spiritual community, and her every gesture carried meaning. To watch her kneel was to see monarchy itself bow to divine order, and to be reminded that your own obedience was doubly bound, by crown and by God. Now, don't imagine that this made everyone pious. Many courtiers grumbled privately about the endless services, the stiff sermons, the lack of genuine devotion. But they still filed into pews week after week. Why? Because absence was a louder statement than any confession of unbelief. You could be a cynic in private, but in public you were a worshiper. Because in the palace, appearances mattered more than intentions. Rituals went beyond Sunday services. Daily grace at meals, prayers before royal journeys, blessings at births, solemn ceremonies at funerals. The rhythm of court life beat in time with the liturgical calendar. Advent wreaths, Easter hymns, harvest thanksgivings. Each season marked by rituals that blended faith and monarchy into one performance of order. If you were a chaplain, you had to tread carefully. Your words needed to uplift without offending, inspire without straying into controversy. A sermon that leaned too political might spark outrage. One that seemed too bland might bore the queen. Balance was everything. Your success wasn't measured by how many souls you saved, but by how smoothly you reinforced the palace's image as a moral compass. And if you were a courtier, the expectations pressed down just as heavily. Show devotion, but not zeal. Sing loudly enough to be heard, but not so loudly as to seem theatrical. Bow your head at the right moment, kneel gracefully, fold your hands just so. Religion here wasn't about ecstasy, it was about choreography. There were, of course, moments of genuine belief. Victoria herself often wrote movingly about her faith, her reliance on prayer, her sense that God guided her rule. But in the palace, even personal faith became public ritual. When she mourned Prince Albert, her chapel attendance became a national symbol of grief. Her black-clad figure at prayer told the empire not just of a widow's sorrow, but of a nation's mourning. And that was the crux of it. Religion at court was not private. It was public, symbolic, woven into the rules of palace life just as tightly as bowing, dining, or dress codes. You didn't pray only for your soul. You prayed for the empire, for appearances, for the reinforcement of a system that linked monarchy to morality. Imagine again, the chapel quiet, the chaplain's voice echoing off the stone, the rustle of silk gowns, the gleam of metals in candlelight. You kneel, you rise, you bow, and all the while you know that God may be watching. But so too are 100 pairs of human eyes, each ready to interpret your devotion, or lack thereof, as a statement about loyalty itself. At court, religion was less about salvation than about survival. To neglect it was to risk not just your soul, but your standing. Faith was another rule in the endless book of palace etiquette, another performance in the theater of monarchy, another clock to which your life was bound. And so you sang the hymns, bowed your head, folded your hands, whether you believed every word or not. Because in the palace, belief was optional. Participation was not. Death in the palace was never private. It was ritual. It was performance. It was another layer of rules to be memorized, rehearsed, and enforced. And no one made this clearer than Queen Victoria herself. When Prince Albert died in 1861, Victoria did not simply mourn. She transformed mourning into an institution. What had once been a family tragedy became a national spectacle, a lifelong performance of grief that reached every corner of the empire. If you think you've been through long funerals or tedious memorials, imagine living in one that stretched for 40 years. That was the palace under Victoria's widowhood. As a courtier or servant, you had no choice but to follow her lead. Black became the dominant color of the palace. For the queen, it was permanent. For you, the rules varied depending on your rank, your relation, and the precise regulations of court mourning. There were charts, believe it or not, that dictated exactly how long one should wear black, when gray or mauve could be introduced, and when, cautiously, color might return. Lose a cousin? 6 weeks of black. Lose a closer relative? 6 months or more. The queen's loss? Indefinite. And it wasn't just clothing. Mourning stretched into every corner of palace life. Jewelry was replaced by jet or onyx. Bright fabrics were banished. Music grew subdued. Even the pace of events slowed. Balls were canceled, entertainments reduced, ceremonies reshaped around somber tones. A court in mourning was a court on pause, though a pause that could last years. For staff and servants, the rules were equally strict. You might find yourself swapping uniforms for darker versions, polishing black crepe instead of silver thread, walking with quieter steps down corridors that seemed perpetually hushed. Even your duties reflected the mood. Curtains drawn longer, fires kept lower, laughter stifled before it ever reached the Queen's ears. Mourning wasn't an individual act. It was a command performance in which everyone, from dukes to doormen, played a role. And the rules didn't stop at the palace gates. Mourning extended outward, shaping national culture. Ladies across Britain ordered black gowns. Men donned armbands. Shops filled their windows with somber displays. Newspapers printed lengthy accounts of mourning etiquette, ensuring that every subject of the empire knew how to grieve properly. Victoria's personal sorrow became a template for collective behavior. Death was no longer simply endured. It was organized. Of course, this wasn't entirely new. Earlier courts had their own elaborate mourning rituals, but Victoria elevated them to an art form. Her devotion to Albert was both heartfelt and strategic. By transforming her widowhood into public ritual, she reinforced the monarchy's image as moral, virtuous, and deeply human. The queen who wept like her subjects also ruled like their mother. Her grief bound the empire together in shared performance. Still, it wasn't easy if you lived inside it. Imagine being a young maid, eager to wear a cheerful ribbon, only to be told it was inappropriate. Imagine a footman reprimanded for whistling too brightly in the corridor. Imagine a courtier forced to cancel a long-anticipated ball because the morning calendar demanded silence. Your own feelings mattered little. The palace's grief swallowed yours whole. And yet, there was power in it. Mourning was loyalty, visible and unmistakable. To appear in anything other than the prescribed attire was to risk whispers of disloyalty. Did Lord So-and-so really wear gray too soon after his cousin's death? Was Lady Such-and-Such's gown too cheerful for the occasion? These judgments could erode reputations, even derail careers. Mourning wasn't just about sadness, it was about discipline. The ceremonies of death were equally theatrical. Funerals at court were orchestrated with military precision. The cortege, the music, the tolling of bells, the exact order of precedence in which mourners followed the coffin. A misplaced step or an incorrectly bowed head could earn scorn. To bury a royal was to perform loyalty on the grandest stage of all. Even memorialization became part of palace routine. Portraits of the departed hung in chambers. Lockets with locks of hair circulated among the family. The Queen herself filled albums with mementos, sketches, and notes, transforming private grief into a visible archive of devotion. Every reminder of death became another reminder of duty. If you were caught inside this world, the effect was eerie. The palace could feel more mausoleum than home, its grandeur cloaked in perpetual shadow. The air itself seemed heavy with grief. And yet, you had to go on, polishing silver that gleamed less brightly, attending dinners that felt like wakes, bowing and curtsying in silence. Life continued, but always in mourning's costume. Victoria's endless grief became a national standard, but also a personal burden on everyone around her. Ministers sighed at her reluctance to appear in public. Courtiers groaned at the length of ceremonies. Servants muttered in whispers about the weight of black fabric. Yet no one dared break the ritual. The Queen's mourning was the court's mourning. To question it was to question loyalty itself. And so the palace lived in shades of black and gray, its rituals bent to the memory of one man. Death was no longer an ending. It was a presence that lingered, woven into daily routine, etched into every corridor. As you leave the chapel after yet another memorial service, your shoes clicking softly on stone, you realize something. Mourning in the palace was not just grief. It was a performance of loyalty, discipline, and permanence. In death, as in life, the monarchy demanded not just obedience, but theater. And in that theater, you were both actor and audience, dressed in black, bound by rules, mourning not only for the dead, but for the living shape of monarchy itself. Palace rules were suffocating enough if you'd been raised with them. But imagine arriving as an outsider, a visiting prince, an ambassador, a foreign envoy fresh off the boat from St. Petersburg or Madrid. You walk into Buckingham Palace expecting warmth, hospitality, maybe even a touch of admiration for your own grandeur. Instead, you find yourself trapped in a maze of protocol so bewildering, you begin to wonder whether you've accidentally enrolled in some kind of imperial obstacle course. It begins with introductions. Forget simply walking up and saying, "Hello, I'm the Duke of something." No. At court, your entire existence must be announced in precise order of precedence. Your name, your title, your honors, each syllable delivered like a drum roll. The master of ceremonies practically reads you into being, and only then do you step forward to bow. Heaven forbid you get the timing wrong. Step too soon, and you're branded arrogant. Step too late, and you look clueless. Either way, the whispers begin, and the bow itself. Ah, the bow. Foreigners often underestimated it. They thought a polite nod would do. Wrong. Your bow must be deep, deliberate, and practiced. Too shallow, and you risk implying disrespect. Too sweeping, and you look like a fool. Add to this the rule that you must never, under any circumstances, turn your back on the Queen, and you suddenly find yourself moonwalking awkwardly out of the room like an early rehearsal for a music video. Diplomatic faux pas were more than embarrassing. They could spark actual scandal. An ambassador who misjudged his bow, who addressed the Queen with the wrong title, who reached for her hand instead of waiting to be offered. These were not mere mistakes. They were breaches of respect, interpreted as insults not just to Victoria, but to Britain itself. And Britain in the 19th century did not take kindly to insults. One wrong gesture, and you might find your entire nation quietly demoted in royal favor. If you imagine yourself in this role, picture the nerves. You've crossed continents, endured long journeys, and memorized endless scripts of diplomacy. Now you stand in a gilded chamber, eyes fixed on a woman in black silk, every word, every step carrying the weight of empire. Courtiers ring the room like hawks, noting your posture, your accent, your shoes. You feel sweat beading beneath your collar. You hope your interpreter has not betrayed you. And then the moment arrives. You bow, you speak, and you pray that history records you as dignified rather than disastrous. Foreign royalty had it no easier. Even a visiting king or emperor had to bend to palace rules. Titles were adjusted, precedents carefully calculated, every movement staged. You might be a monarch in your own land, but here you were, one among many, folded neatly into Victoria's hierarchy. To resist the rules was unthinkable. Even outsiders bowed to Victorian order because the alternative was chaos, or worse, humiliation. The dinners and banquets added another layer of stress. Seating charts for foreign envoys were political landmines. Place a French ambassador too far from the Queen, and France might mutter about disrespect. Seat a German prince too close, and others grumbled about favoritism. Every inch of table placement was debated, rearranged, and debated again, until the final chart was more carefully balanced than a treaty itself. For the diplomats seated there, the meal was agony. Do you risk speaking too freely? Do you risk saying too little? Do you remember to put down your fork the instant the queen stops eating? The food may be magnificent, but you barely taste it. Behind the grandeur, of course, the servants rolled their eyes. To them, foreign dignitaries were just another set of overdressed, anxious guests to shepherd through corridors and feed with dishes they would hardly finish. But to the court, each visit was a test. Would Britain emerge looking polished and commanding, or would a single gaffe undo the performance of supremacy? It was theater, but theater with consequences. A misplaced chair, a misread title, even a mispronounced name could ripple outward into diplomatic tension. The palace thrived on precision for a reason. It wasn't just about maintaining dignity. It was about projecting power. The queen's composure, the court's discipline, the flawless choreography of bows, titles, and dinners, all of it told the world that Britain was the empire of order. And outsiders learned quickly. An envoy who stumbled once took extra care not to stumble again. Royal visitors studied etiquette manuals as if cramming for an exam. Everyone adapted, because no one wanted to be remembered as the diplomat who sneezed in the Queen's presence or called her Your Highness instead of Your Majesty. If you're standing there as a foreigner, you realize the truth with startling clarity. You're not really engaging with a monarch. You're being absorbed into a system, bent to its rules, measured against its rituals. Your individuality matters less than your ability to conform. And so you bow deeper, speak more cautiously, smile at the right moments, and retreat without turning your back. You may represent a sovereign nation, but inside the palace, you are simply another actor in the endless play. And when you leave, exhausted, your dignity intact, you carry with you not just memories of candlelight and ceremony, but the realization that Britain's greatest power wasn't its army or its navy. It was its ability to make even kings and ambassadors bow, quite literally, to its rules. Night finally falls over the palace. Lamps are dimmed, corridors empty, and the once bustling halls echo only with the sound of guards pacing outside. Their boots strike the flagstones with mechanical precision, a reminder that even in silence, the machine of monarchy never truly stops. Curtains are drawn, fires banked low, and somewhere in the kitchens, the last pans are scrubbed before the servants slip off to their narrow beds. You might think the palace sleeps, but really it waits. The chandeliers rest, the bells pause, the court bows out, only to begin again at dawn. For you, though, this is the one moment of calm, the endless bows, the rehearsed smiles, the desperate attempts not to commit a social crime. All set aside until morning. You survived another day without catastrophe. No wrong fork, no poorly timed bow, no scandalous whisper traced back to your name. That, in palace terms, is victory. As you sink into the stillness, think of the palace for what it truly was. Not a home, not even just a workplace, but an endless theater. A stage where rules weighed heavier than crowns, and where glamour always came laced with suffocation. Every smile rehearsed, every step choreographed, every word carefully rationed. The world may have seen majesty. Those inside often saw exhaustion. And yet, like all theaters, it kept its audience spellbound. Britain, Europe, even the world, looked on and believed in the magic, because the actors never dropped their masks, not even at night. Now, it's time for you to close your eyes. Let the palace fade into shadows. The rules dissolve into dreams. The sound of guards' boots blur into distant echoes. You've wandered through a world of silks, sighs, and suffocating etiquette. You've survived another day in the palace machine, and now you can drift away, free of all its rules. But before you do, remember this. Subscribing is a small act of acknowledgement, one that keeps these stories alive. Without it, I'm just another nameless servant, pacing dark corridors unseen and forgotten. With it, you're supporting what I do, making sure history doesn't vanish into silence. And as you drift off tonight, remember you can take these stories with you ad-free anytime. My first collection, Victorian Madness Volume 1, is available now, complete with a bonus insider story you won't hear on YouTube. Only a handful of copies are released at this time, and the link is waiting in both the description and pinned comment. Sleep well.